Morning, folks, and welcome to today's episode called Michael Dell, my favourite business person with a question mark, because I'm sure I'll come across other people I admire for their business acumen. But after researching Dell for this episode, he's currently at the top. He's one of those people who is just brilliant at business and seems to have been brilliant from the get-go. Like at 16, he made more money in one summer than his teachers made all year. At 18, he was building computers in his dorm room and sales were up to $80,000 some months. By 27, he was the youngest CEO to ever lead a Fortune 500 company. And he did it by always thinking about how to consistently eliminate unnecessary steps. But he's tough as well. He's not just some analytical, robotic business guy. There were big battles with Carl Icahn where Dell comes out on top. But what I really, really love about Michael Dell is he does it all with no ego, no scandal, not much anyway, no politics, just great business. It's a cracking episode. Enjoy. So Michael Dell was born in Houston, Texas on the 23rd of February 1965. Father, orthodontist. Mother was a stockbroker and financial consultant, and he had two brothers. Interestingly, his brother Adam has had a very successful career as a corporate attorney and then in early tech investors in companies like Hot Jobs and Open Table. Now, in terms of his upbringing, there's one thing that stands out. Dell's mother always told her sons to play nice but win. And Dell says that's something that he tried to live by. Indeed, his autobiography was called Play Nice But Win. By the time he was 12, Dell had started a small mail order business, trading in collectible stamps. He even rented his own post office box and began advertising to hobbyists. And it was a proper little venture. Like, he made about $2,000 profit, which for a 12-year-old in 1977, that is a lot of money. At 15, he bought one of the first Apple II computers. And the first thing he did after opening the box was take the whole thing apart. As he said, a good thing about the early personal computers is that they had standardized chips. You could literally see exactly how the thing was working. That was sort of the classroom for me. Then in the summer of 1981, this is a fantastic story. And it really shows you how Dell thought about business. So he landed a job selling newspaper subscriptions for the Houston Post. Now, he was only 16, earning $5 an hour. And what he was meant to do was cold call random people and sell new subscriptions. But Dell thought about it, and what he did next feeds into one of the things that has driven Dell from the very start. In his own words, I've been fascinated with the idea of eliminating unnecessary steps. So in this instance, he was thinking, why waste my time calling people who are not likely to buy? Why not narrow down my list to the people most likely to buy? And so he started analysing data. Now, this was long before data was even a buzzword. He discovered that newly married couples and new homeowners were the best prospects. Then he found a way to get their names by accessing public records of marriage licenses and mortgages. Next, he gathered all the lists from 16 county courthouses and used his Apple II to sort the data and then send targeted mail offers to these prospects. By the end of that summer, Dell had earned over $18,000 in commissions, more than most of his teachers made in a year. 1983, he enrolled at the University of Texas at Austin to study pre-med because, his parents wanted him to become a doctor. But within weeks, he was spending more time in his dorm room than in class because he noticed that local computer stores, they often discounted outdated or overstocked IBM PCs and the components. So he began buying the excess inventory. He was then upgrading machines, reselling them to students and to small businesses. He placed ads in the local newspapers and hobbyist magazines, undercutting retail prices. And by late 1983, he had to rent a condo off campus to keep up with these orders. Some months, his sales hit between $50,000 and $80,000. And remember, he was still a freshman. But of course, as a result of all this, outside work, his grades were collapsing and his parents were not happy. And that Thanksgiving, they sat him down and gave him an ultimatum. Shut down the business and focus on school, or he would lose their support. He agreed to stop for about 10 days. And it was during that brief pause that Dell made up his mind. As he said himself, My parents telling me to stop doing it is probably what caused the company to get created. And in May 1984, he launched PCs Limited. His idea, it was simple but radical at the time. Sell computers directly to customers and cut out the retailer. Customers called in or sent in mail orders, he'd buy stock PCs, upgrade the parts and deliver them cheaper than shops. And orders, they poured in. In his first full month after launch, PCs Unlimited pulled in $180,000 in sales. By 1985, he was assembling his own computers from scratch under a new name, Dell Computer Corporation, and the first in-house design was called the Turbo PC, and it sold for a base price of $795. Now, when I say base price, I mean that's without any, additional storage, etc. that the customer might want. But to put that into context, a base model IBM cost over $1,500, so he was nearly half the price of an IBM. Also, instead of going into a computer shop and having to deal with salespeople trying to sell you stuff you probably don't want, Dell customers would call a toll-free number, pick their specs, and have the computer shipped straight to them. Now, it was direct, efficient, and it was really, really revolutionary for this time. And it was a good time to be selling computers. It was the mid-80s. Like, the PC boom was at its height. And Dell had a business model that was totally different to all the other big manufacturers like IBM, Compaq, Apple, because Dell's model was focused on building a super, super efficient supply chain. Remember, from the get-go, he'd been fascinated with eliminating unnecessary steps. So every computer was built only after the order was placed. Components arrived just in time for production. Orders were tracked in real time. There were no warehouses full of unsold inventory because that was a problem that plagued his rivals. And of course, crucially, this model, it allowed him to deliver better value to the customer while also making good margins. Within a year, sales went from $6 million to $70 million. And by 1987, he was just 22. The company went public, raising $30 million, and its market value hit $85 million on day one. Now, in terms of what Dell was like, he was described as being intensely private and notoriously shy. That has changed over the years with encouragement from his wife Susan and some mentors, and he has cultivated a more approachable public image, but he still is a pretty private man. So by 1992, Dell was only 27 years old, and he had become the youngest CEO ever to head a Fortune 500 company. Annual revenue passed $2 billion. But it wasn't all plain sailing. In 1993, Dell made a push into selling through retailers. That's a move that went totally against everything the company stood for. The thinking was that, we can reach more customers if we go through retailers. It didn't work. Margins shrank, and, the clarity of that direct model, it got muddled. But within 2 years, Dell pulled back from retail and doubled down on its original idea. In his own words, we got confused, we thought we could do both, turns out we couldn't. And that correction paid off. Through the late 90s, Dell became one of the most admired companies in America. It dominated the PC market, and in 1996, Dell took the next logical step. .com boom was at its height, so they went online. They launched Dell.com, allowing customers to configure and purchase computers online. Within a few months, the site was bringing in $1 million a day. By 1999, online sales were at $40 million a day. Now, to give a sense of the growth that was happening in Dell, between 1994 and 1999, Dell's revenue rose from $3.5 billion to over $25 billion. It was selling a computer every 5 seconds. And it did so, we mentioned it, but it's worth saying it again. It had a structure that rivals couldn't match. Because of the way it was selling, it was working with negative working capital. In other words, customers paid before Dell even built their machines, while suppliers were paid later. It effectively made the company self-financing. But then came the early 2000s. The dot-com bubble burst, and after years and years of double-digit growth, demand for PCs went down sharply. Dell itself had to cut 10% of its workforce, around 5,000 workers, but it emerged from the downturn better off than its competitors and now became the number one PC manufacturer in the world. So after 2 decades as CEO, Dell decided, I'm going to take a step back. In 2004, the job went to Kevin Rowlands, who had been his longtime deputy. Now, Dell remained as chairman, but he wanted to focus more on strategy. The company started diversifying into server and storage sales, low-cost printers. They even went into consumer electronics like flat panel TVs and music players, but they had very limited success there. But then in 2006, they started hitting real headwinds. There was a few factors for this. First of all, Hewlett-Packard was definitely getting the upper hand. A few years earlier, they had bought Compaq, and we will look into that deal in a different story at some stage, because that was a hugely controversial deal for its CEO at the time, and she was replaced by this guy called Mark Hurd, and Mark Hurd was doing a very, very good job at improving manufacturing, channel distribution, and really, narrowing Dell's cost advantage. At the same time, Lenovo had bought IBM's PC business in 2005, and it was starting to make inroads. And of course, we are now seeing the re-emergence of Apple. And while it can be argued rightly that Apple's market share in PCs was pretty small, its overall influence or impact on the PC market had started as far back as 1999, when Jobs introduced, you remember those beautiful, colourful iMacs? Well, with these, and then with the iPod, and with iTunes and the MacBook, which came out in 2006, Jobs was changing consumers' perception of what a personal computer meant. Like, he really was reshaping the market towards mobility, towards integrated software and hardware. And this was even before the iPhone came out. So this was a huge seismic change in PCs. So there was these things happening within the PC market, but then another big incident happened in 2006, because several Dell laptops caught fire, including one that burst into flames during a conference in Japan, and the images and videos of these went viral. Melted laptops, smoke rising from conference tables. I remember when this happened, it was all over the news. Now, the fault was with the Sony made batteries, but the image of burning Dell laptops, it really damaged the company's hard-won reputation for reliability. And Dell was forced to recall 4.1 million batteries worldwide. At that time, the biggest electronics recall ever. And at the same time, revenue performance was slipping. For several quarters across 2005 and 2006, Dell missed Wall Street's earnings expectations. And by the end of 2006, Hewlett-Packard overtook Dell to become the number one PC manufacturer. And to make matters worse, as if things weren't bad enough, regulators were also circling, because the SEC had opened an investigation into Dell's accounting practices. They suspected that the company had been manipulating earnings reports, and later it did emerge that Dell had quietly accepted hundreds of millions of dollars in undisclosed rebates from Intel, payments designed to exclude AMD chips and inflate margins. Ultimately, the case was settled. Dell Inc. paid $100 million, and Michael Dell himself personally contributed $4 million, all without admitting default. It was a black mark. Small, but a significant one. And one of the few moments, I think, really, where Dell's own principles came into question, because in fairness, Dell never really courted controversy. He rarely did or said anything to cause offence. Unless, of course, you're an Apple fan, because Apple fans will probably never forgive him for a comment he made back in October 1997. This at a time when Apple now was on its knees. So someone at a tech conference asked Dell what he'd do if he were running Apple. And he said, "What would I do? I'd shut it down and give the money back to the shareholders." Now, to be fair, Apple had just posted the biggest losses in its history. The company, it looked doomed. And Steve Jobs had just returned as CEO, but his response to Michael Dell's comment was, "Fuck Michael Dell." He even put a photo of Dell on a slide with a bullseye over his face at one Apple event. However, the animosity seemed to have thawed, because Dell and Jobs, they spoke about potential deals, they did explore business ideas, and while they never actually collaborated, apparently they did come to respect each other. Forgive the quick interruption, but I want to let you know about our subscription service. For just $1.99 a month, you get every weekly episode completely ad-free, so you can enjoy the story without any interruptions. Subscribers also unlock a library of special episodes from when Keith was still co-hosting with me, including a 3-part deep dive on Disney and a 2-parter on Guinness. They're brilliant. Now, Keith isn't part of the show anymore, but I still have a good few hour-long episodes that I recorded with him,
and they're going to be released on the 1st of every month over the next few months, again for subscribers only. All of that for just $1.99 a month. If you'd like to join, it's really simple. On Spotify, just tap on the little lock symbol next to the bonus episodes in the feed. On Apple Podcasts, click on the show and you'll see the option to subscribe. Or if you prefer Patreon, head to patreon.com/Great Business Stories. There's also a link in the About section at the top of the podcast page to the Patreon page. And of course, if subscribing isn't for you right now, that's grand. Following the show and telling a friend about it is a huge help. Alright, back to the story.
But getting back to 2006, a very bad year for Dell. You had the SEC investigations, you had the recall, you had HP becoming number one. Dell shares had dropped over 40% in 2 years. And so in January 2007, Michael Dell returned as CEO, and he wasted no time. He brought in new executives, launched a plan to rethink everything from design to customer service. And Dell later admitted that the company had been running on autopilot. It was too obsessed with cost cutting and it was disconnected from its customers. So his challenge when he came back as CEO, it was huge because the world of technology, it was moving at a massively fast rate. Laptops had basically become a commodity. Margins were thin. And the next wave was already emerging. You had smartphones, cloud computing, enterprise IT. And this is the thing about Dell. He not only took the time to see where the company could be, but he also re-energized his employees by using the following tactic. I love this. So he'd stand in front of his teams and ask them to picture a rival 5 years down the line, a faster rival, leaner, smarter, the kind of rival that would, eat Dell alive. And then he'd say, that's who we have to become. Now, it wasn't about fear for fear's sake. It was more about urgency, turning complacency into competition with themselves. As Dell said, if you don't have a crisis, make one, to get people excited, motivated, and to drive the necessary change. And he also pushed for what he called a company of owners. So he gave his executives a huge amount of space to do their own thing. And in doing so, he gave them this sense of ownership. And see, when you do that, and when you have that sense of ownership, you feel like you're building something special. And I just think Dell is so smart. I get the feeling that in the same way that he examines and analyzes everything in relation to efficiency, the supply chain, all that, he also, I'm guessing, devours information, books, etc., on how to get the most out of people. And then he thinks about it and decides what methods will work best for his company. And it works. I mean, he realized that results aren't achieved by managing key people. It's by giving them that sense of ownership. So from 2009 onwards, Dell started spending aggressively on acquisitions. Over the next 4 years, he spent more than $13 billion buying companies that could help shift Dell away from hardware towards services and software, because he could see that's where the future was. The most important of these acquisitions was Perot Systems. He bought it for $3.9 billion in 2009. It was founded by H. Ross Perot. Now, he's a former US presidential candidate. He got almost 20% of the vote in 1992. I remember that election, and I remember Perot. There's a lot of really, really great stories about this guy, so I'm definitely doing an episode on him. But this acquisition, it gave Dell an instant foothold into IT services, government contracts, and consulting. Now, that same year, Dell experimented with smartphones and tablets. They flopped spectacularly. And so Dell quickly pulled out of that sector. Again, it shows his ability to not be afraid to test something, but also the flexibility to get out if it's not working and get out quickly. By 2012, almost half of Dell profits were coming from servers, storage, and services rather than PCs. But the transformation wasn't happening fast enough. The PC market was still in a very, very bad way. The iPad, which was released in 2010, and the rise of smartphones, they were cutting big into PC sales. In early 2013, global PC shipments fell by 14% year on year, the steepest drop ever recorded. And Dell himself, he was frustrated. He believed that Wall Street didn't understand what he was trying to do. That, their short-term obsession with margins and quarterly numbers, it made long-term investment really, really tough. So, in late 2012, he began exploring a radical option, taking Dell private. And on February 5th, 2013, Dell announced that it would go private in a $24.4 billion deal led by Michael Dell himself, along with the private equity firm Silver Lake. But not everyone was happy with this. Southeastern Asset Management, Dell's largest outside shareholder, they called the offer grossly undervalued. And then came Carl Icahn. He started buying Dell stock and he built a sizable stake and he declared war on the deal. He promised years of litigation if the deal went ahead. Now, I dug into this because, it's Carl Icahn, and any time he gets involved, there's always plenty of drama. And in Dell's autobiography, there's a great passage where he describes going to dinner at Icahn's luxurious apartment while this battle was going on. Dell wanted to find out what Icahn's intentions were if Icahn was to take over the company. And the passage is brilliant because in just a few paragraphs, Dell paints a picture of Icahn as a terrible father, being married to a woman who can't cook and who has very little to say. On the business front, Icahn, according to Dell, isn't well prepared for the meeting, and crucially, Icahn isn't able to handle Dell's directness. Icahn comes across as a fumbling, miserable old man who doesn't have any long-term plans for Dell, the company, and he's basically up to his own green-mailing tricks. In other words, he's only invested in Dell so he can be seen as a threat and then get bought out at a higher price and make some easy money. And when I first read that passage in Dell's book, I thought, geez, Dell has been really harsh on Icahn here. But then when you think about it, Dell had put everything he had into this company. Like, he's quoted as saying, I will care about this company after I'm dead. And here was Icahn threatening to take it over without any long-term plan, with no regard for the company or its employees. Like, I can see 100% why Dell was so mad and had such a dislike for Icahn. A few years later at a conference, Dell had the following to say about Icahn. He is a bad guy. He lies. He has no ethical boundaries. He will say anything, do anything. I have no time for him. Now, what is interesting from that book is that at their dinner, Icahn suggests that $14 would be the price at which he's willing to do the deal and walk away. And as the shareholder vote approached that summer, Dell didn't have enough support, so he raises his offer to $13.75 per share. And the deal was approved by shareholder. And while Icahn admitted defeat, he does end up getting pretty close to what he wanted. He wanted $14, he ended up getting $13.75. But Dell comes out of it best. He invested about $4 billion of his own money and emerged owning about 75% of the company. So, now we're in 2014, and Dell's plan is to double down on enterprise technology while, of course, protecting the PC base. And there were signs it was working. Dell's PC shipments in the US had grown nearly 20% that quarter, 5 times the industry rate. It was the company's 7th consecutive quarter of market share gains. Then, in early 2015, Dell reached out to Joseph Tucci, the longtime CEO of EMC. This was the Boston-based storage giant, about a potential merger. The two men then met privately at the World Economic Forum in Davos that January to discuss it. Now, to put this meeting in context, EMC was under serious pressure because activist investors wanted it broken up because EMC had a huge cloud storage business called VMware and a host of subsidiaries like RSA and SecureWorks. Dell rightly believed that a combination of EMC and Dell could create a full end-to-end tech company at a scale that no one could match, covering everything from laptops to cloud storage to data security. The discussion stayed secret for months. Negotiations went back and forth, and then in October 2015, it was official. Dell was buying EMC for $67 billion. It was the largest tech acquisition in history at that time. Dell and his backers contributed just $3 billion, and the rest came through debt financing. Dell was now the largest privately controlled company. It was serving like 98% of Fortune 500 companies. But with close to $50 billion in gross debt, like, a lot of critics felt that Dell, it would struggle to innovate under the weight of that debt. But by 2018, 3 years after going private, Dell was thriving. But the mountain of debt, it still hung over it, and the private equity guys, they wanted their payday. So Dell decided to take the company public, but in a very roundabout way. Instead of a traditional IPO, he'd buy out the VMware tracking stock he'd issued in the EMC deal. Now, here's what that meant, because it is a bit confusing. When Dell bought EMC, it created a tracking stock. Now, that's basically a shadow share that mirrored VMware's performance, but didn't give investors any real ownership of VMware itself. By 2018, instead of doing a big flashy IPO, Dell decided to buy those tracking shares back, pay the holders in cash and new Dell stock, and in doing so, relist the whole company on the market, as I said, without going through the whole IPO roadshow. The deal valued VMware stock at $21.7 billion. Everything was going smoothly until, yeah, you guessed it, Carl Icahn crashed the party. He'd built up an 8% stake and called Dell's offer a 42% discount. Now, after a tense few months and an extra $5 billion sweetener to keep shareholders happy, Dell finally got his way, and by the end of 2018, Dell was public again. VMware now, it was still 81% owned by Dell, and it was performing really strongly. So in 2021, Dell spun off VMware. In doing so, they cut Dell's debt by about a quarter, and by early 2022, its own credit rating was finally upgraded to investment grade. So this was a real, symbolic moment for a company that just a few years ago had been written off as over-leveraged. So a fantastic success for Dell. Then came the AI wave. In 2023, Dell teamed up with NVIDIA to build what they called AI factories. These were pre-built stacks that let companies train and run their own AI systems. Initial sales hit about $10 billion by the first year's end, with forecasts doubling by 2026. And if that weren't enough, Dell is doing great business here. Broadcom swooped in and bought VMware for $69 billion. And even after the spin-off, Dell had personally held 39% of VMware. So he personally made $27 billion from that deal. And so when we look at Dell's overall wealth, because at the time of recording, Dell is the 10th richest person in the world with a fortune of $155 billion, we can see that about 40 to 50 billion of that comes from his stake in the business. You also have the cash he would have gotten from VMware, but the majority of his wealth, you're talking maybe 70 or 80 billion, comes from DFO management. This is the family office that manages his personal wealth, and it has a huge array of investments, from Four Seasons Resorts to Endeavour, the company behind WWE and the UFC, to PVH Core, the apparel company that owns brands including Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger. And this diversification, the fact that most of his wealth isn't tied to his main company, it tells you everything about Michael Dell. He really thinks things through. He stands back and gives a lot of thought on how to do things better. And he's done that throughout his life. And what I really loved about this story is that while there's plenty of business drama, there wasn't any scandal. Not really. There was no politics, no ego. Now, just to be clear, there's nothing better than a story that has one or all of those elements. But I also love business. And what I love about Dell's story is that for the most part, it's all about the business and how he navigated his way through so many difficult times in the PC market, how he outthought and outfought sharks like Carl Icahn, and how he did it by more or less staying true to his mother's maxim of play nice but win. And look, he's made mistakes, plenty of them, but I think in the grand scheme of things, he's probably one of the best and most admirable business people. It's what makes Dell such a great business story. And with that, we come to listeners' emails. And this one is from John, who I assume is from Ireland. I could be wrong. And he asked if I could do a story on Michael O'Leary, the very, very colourful boss of Ryanair. And John, rest assured, O'Leary is on my list, and it'll be a fantastic story. And thanks also for the kind words in the email that you sent. Really appreciate it. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story that you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.